Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this episode, we'll take a somewhat different turn that we usually do. That is to say, we'll talk about political philosophy a bit, or some main concepts of political philosophy, which we rarely tend to do, being focused mostly on metaphysics and such things, and social commentary, but from the specific angle. Now, there is a lot of terms that come from the sphere of political philosophy that are being used in everyday life, in media, and in so-called intellectual disputes. And I'm underlying the so-called part. Namely, those are terms that very rarely are defined, and if they are defined, they are not defined to my satisfaction. So I'll try to give a different angle, a sort of genealogy of these terms, in a somewhat offhand manner, as is wont in this podcast, because of course the truly exhaustive approach would be through essay and written analysis and so on and so forth. But as road signs on the way of towards the way of understanding something, I think this podcast can do their task to everybody's satisfaction. Now, one of those terms I would like to talk about now is the term socialism. I think you'll all agree that it is being used far and wide in all kinds of different meanings. Now, as Aristotle does, we'll first try to see what people commonly associate with understanding of socialism, with a caveat that there were no isms in Aristotle's age, and even much, much later. Therefore, when Aristotle uses this principle of taking interest in not public opinion, what I meant to say, in fact, in common understanding of something, that there is always a true in this. There were no isms at that time, because it is very arguable, is there any truth in isms? However, there is a common understanding of socialism. If you ask somebody what being socialist means, it almost always equals with being leftists. It's not really something to identify, but it's close enough. We'll see why. Socialism is a kind of political theory or understanding of politics that puts focus and accent on common well-being of citizens. Usually the word citizen is used. Note this. And it is put in contradistinction to capitalism, of which we won't talk now. And whereas the capitalism would be in a broadest sense some kind of, if not exploitatory outright, but let's say that kind of social praxis, social political praxis or theory that doesn't really essentially put any focus on the well-being of community or the well-being, and by this I mean the well-being, and this is very important, of the lowest strata of community, of political community, politeia in Greek. I'm thinking in Greek terms, so I'll try to underline this, so don't get me wrong. I don't really think in modern or contemporary philosophical terms at all. Now, there is truth in this, to an extent that socialism indeed does have to do with the lowest, with the capital L, as I would put it. It is, in fact, not the political philosophy or political practice that is concerned on the well-being of our quote-unquote brothers and sisters. As I saw just recently one Croatian semi-literate express her opinion that socialism has anything to do with kind of brotherhood or sisterhood of men. It doesn't. But it does have to do with the lowest common denominator. This is very important. And this understanding is partially correct. What is not correct about it is, as I already said in example, and I'll say it in abstract, it doesn't have this moral focus that people ascribe to it. There is nothing moral initially, nothing of philanthropy in the original understanding of socialism. Socialism, I'll give a provisionary definition, and please note that these podcasts are not to be taken as some kind of final, not even final word, of course, but a kind of exhaustive explanations of something. They are just here to incite thinking. Due to me not having really time to at this moment to write long articles and so on, I have to admit. Now, socialism is an understanding of man and the world and man's relation to the world, where man is understood as formed from the outside by the social forces. Not the other way around, that the social forces and institutions and social givens, so to speak, the wider society in general is created from the individual men outside, or aggregate group of individual men. No. This is the society we live in socialist terms, is always a priori to us, in apparent contradistinction to, for instance, liberalist individualism, where you have this idea, but they are not that different. So you shall see this different idea of society being an aggregate of individuals creating it as if being atoms. This atomized understanding of human being is, I think, also present in socialism, and now we'll see why. And men, therefore, everything we are is in fact created by society at large. The question how this society came to pass in the first place, so that the whole precedes the part, is and not something you can answer in terms of political philosophy, especially modern political philosophy of socialism, and they rarely do give satisfactory answer. They cannot give it, but sometimes those answers can be rather imaginative. As such, socialism is completely modern political theory, of course. There was nothing remotely like it, in my opinion, in antiquity and Middle Ages, for the simple reason that you could have societies that resemble what we now call socialist model, but you don't have a raison d'etre of socialism in those societies. That is to say, there are presuppositions in socialism that didn't exist before New Age of modernity. One of them being of man as a central principle of philosophy. That is to say, there were no understanding of man as being the starting point of any kind of inquiry of the meaning of life, purpose of life, purpose of being in general. The idea of meaning of life is also quite novel idea. It's a modern idea. It's all based on a certain humanism, that is to say, a certain act of putting a man in center of everything, and then inquiring further. This is a telltale sign of modern age. So people who advocate for socialism, they don't advocate for brothers, for the better life for their brothers and sisters. No, they advocate for reforming a society according to their own theories and understanding of what society should be, by putting sovereignty in the hands of the lowest common denominator, defined in some way. So, in this sense, what you in the West call SJWs are socialists. I mean, socialists that this is far beyond the level of classical socialist theoreticians and politicians who were more often than not very well educated men, and more often than not, especially in England, aristocrats. But the idea that you have to change society at large, the outside, the external to a man, what is external to man, in order to change man, this is socialism. And to use the lowest common denominator means to pick a part of society that in some way can be understood as one in all, as present in all units of society, atoms of society, because as all modern metaphysics or metaphysics-based political philosophy, socialism is relying upon atomist understanding of man. I will talk about that also. So, for instance, this lowest common denominator can be, and usually is, those who suffer the most, those who are miserable the most, those who have nothing to lose, those who have no properties, but are in a sense pure societal units. Sometimes in more, let's say, lyrically disposed socialists, this would be termed as most humane, but the real meaning is quite cold calculation, because socialism is based on quantity, or idea that quantity gives birth to quality, something that Marxism, for instance, which is not exactly identical with socialism in general, but this is part of this strain of socialist philosophy, made a cornerstone of its dialectical materialism. So, for instance, you have something that early socialist, but early Enlightenment philosophes, called masse générale, or the general mass. That is to say, the mass of humanity. The reason why they were talking about this aggregate of all people, and this aggregate of all people is the sovereign of history. Sovereign meaning that it has the real claim for power, and therefore a real claim for changing everything into its image. This is very important to understand, because sovereignty is the question of form of political community, or politeia, is generally where sovereignty lies and what is the purpose of politeia. For instance, in Aristotle, purpose, whether it is good politeia or not, is deemed primarily by houheneka, purpose, the final cause. And the final cause should be common good. Remember this, public interest, common good. There is a very, very, very short. Sovereignty, on the other hand, is who rules, who brings about this purpose. In socialism, purpose is, I would claim, and this could be very well disputed, is in fact utilitarian. It is utilitarian because it is the most general common denominator. And this is happiness. Happiness understood in quite oblique manner, as some kind of being well fed and being just happy, not suffering in a sensual sense, because this comes from enlightenment. Enlightenment was a kind of quasi-half philosophy, in a sense that it never could do anything but recognize for instance, that man is a sensible creature, the creature of senses, and that senses circumscribe what can be known, and also that senses circumscribe everything that can be done. And finally, that there is no principle of any kind outside of this sensual, material sphere or world. Therefore, they were looking for something, as is natural for intellect. They even warped and crippled intellect, as Enlightenment intellect was. It's natural for it to seek these universal causes, to go beyond this, but they couldn't go beyond. So in the confines of the external, of the sensual, they tried to find the principle. Not finding it, they created it. One way to create this principle is to pick something from this world and project it to be a principle, which takes the place of metaphysical principle or even God. This is, for instance, mas general, because everybody can identify as part of it. If you cannot identify as part of it, for instance, if you are a king in 18th century France, the course of history that should be pursued would be to bring you down to the level of lowest common denominator. Everybody must be equal. What I want to stress is there is absolutely not a trace of compassion in this. This is not about brothers and sisters, so-called. This is about metaphysics, understood as a struggle for power, because this is politicized metaphysics. Modern metaphysics is, in fact, a kind of political act, intellectual political weapon, I might even say, ultimate weapon, when you think about it. And this is where socialism comes from. Now, you will notice that this utilitarian principle of maximum happiness is hardly to be understood as socialist, because it comes from its clearest definition from Jeremy Bentham, who was the teacher of John Stuart Mill, the ultimate liberal. But lo and behold, the common ground exists. For instance, I already mentioned the term public interest, that is very, very prevalent even today, especially in these leftist circles and in green, so-called green left. They love this public interest, of course, not having a clue what they mean by it. Public interest is understanding of the whole of society as one atomic individual, to put it most shortly. Because such thing as public interest does not exist. What it is, in fact, is an inversion of the original principle of common good. And common good is not simply maximum happiness. First of all, it's not quantified. Common good can very well mean more good for one group of people, less good for other group of people in society. It's not based on equality. It's based, I would claim, together with Aristotle and those who accept his ideas to some extent in politics, I would say it's a nature. It's about human nature. And it's about virtue and so on and so forth. This is not at work in socialism, in public interest. There is nothing good and bad about it. And it is always sold to people as a kind of moralistic teaching. It's not moralistic teaching. There is nothing moral about it. It's a form of struggle for power. And this struggle for power is, in my opinion, I would say totalitarian by its very principles. In the sense that this mas general, and I'm using mas general is a term that was used, I think, first by Helvetius. He is one of those philosophers of Enlightenment, early ones. But it was taken up by others, whereas this maximum of happiness, I refer in fact to Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, whose intellectual struggle for maximum of happiness ended up in his life's work being developing the image of the perfect prison. Perfect prison, I repeat. That is to say, perfect liberal prison, maybe we might say. Maybe we are a bit unjust towards the liberals, but this is what Jeremy Bentham ended up with extreme utilitarian individualism. I won't talk about it now because it really deserves to be subject in itself to analyze his panopticon, because this is the idea of prison where everybody in fact curates himself. Everybody is in fact his own jailer. This is a liberal ideal, I might add. But socialism is now the subject. So this idea, but this is, I take this example just to show you how wrong it is to take people, modern philosophers, for their word. Because what I mean is never what I think. And there is a principal reason for this, because those theories are in fact reformations, or rather inversions of what already existed. So public interest is downright inversion of common good. And common good is not something that is constructed by man, and in an understanding of common good, man is not a sovereign. God is a sovereign. Although in pre-Christian times, they wouldn't really put it this way. They would rather maybe put it that nature, God-given nature, or cosmic law in the ancient understanding of the cosmos, is sovereign. That is to say, at least a moral principle that is completely out of human hands, in the terms that humans can change it or something like that. And the laws, the idea of law in antiquity and Middle Ages, this is something different, something far more, I would say, spiritual than we understand it now. And now, of course, people who interpret these previous times project modern image, for instance, of law in somebody like Aquinas or Aristotle and Plato and such people. But socialism is therefore something, a kind of political metaphysics, modern political metaphysics, that is based on understanding man as being created by social environment, rather than the being that itself from itself creates this social environment. Of course, there is always an interaction. No socialist is that stupid to claim that there is not. But note, for instance, that this is a problem for them, and what they wanted is mostly to transcend this. Therefore, so the society would reform man in the form that he can gradually overpower his environment completely, even his social environment, and to recreate society to express his essence. This is a bit deeper socialism. This is already stepping into Marxism, because we have political metaphysics that was built by a man who actually had some philosophical education, and who was a bit deeper thinker than philosophers, but not deeper in a good sense. Deeper in the sense that he went deeper in undermining everything that was good in the philosophy of his age. I'm talking of Karl Marx, of course. But what is important to take from this podcast is this idea, and I think that this can be defended even in this rather superficial podcast manner, that socialism is in no way a kind of philosophy of human good or compassion. There is no zilch of this. Never forget, for instance, I will conclude with this, with people like heroes of our day and age in certain parts of Western world, like Bertrand Russell, who was a socialist, I think, all his life. He wrote so much books that I couldn't keep track of his evolution, quote unquote, because even one of his books is too boring for me to read. But there is one, it's a rather infamous impact of science on society. And that book, which is also a totalitarian manifesto, rather like Panopticon of Jeremy Bentham, is a good example of socialist thinking. And the specific coldness and detachment, and not to say cruelty of Bertrand Russell is at play there. You can see it clearly, and it has it kind of makes you understand why really aristocrats, for instance in England, were attracted to socialism, where you see that this idea of remolding man from the outside, how appealing it is. And in order to do that, you have to have a substance that you have to work on. You cannot work on substance that is not present in all things if you want to recreate society and recreate the world, because world, society, it kind of amounts to same in certain understandings of modernity, because society is this construction of meaning, and man has only to do with meaning, so changing society would be changing the world. And to change it, you have to grasp its substance. And its substance in socialism, but I would also say in its apparent antipode liberalism, is a lowest common denominator. The miserable of the miserable. And taking this lowest common denominator has nothing to do with compassion, I repeat for the nth times. It has all to do with power, because it's an attempt to exploit the power of inertia, the power of quantity, the power of that is present in all, in a sense that it drives everything back into one common soup of indistinguishable, featureless beings, of atoms and so on and so forth. So this is where it comes from. And it's very interesting. I think it's very good to know this, because in everyday life you'll encounter, in fact, the policies and about which you don't know really where they come from. And this public interest is, I think, the very good example, because it is a kind of like trying to make a bridge between liberal and socialist understanding of men. Both are modern, and both have nothing to do with morality initially, and I would say they cannot have really nothing to do with human nature, also because they take not man as it is, but projection of man as they imagine he should be, because public interest is kind of like making society one huge atomic individual, because only individuals have interests. You can have not only interest groups, you can have groups in society who are having common interests, but this also comes as a kind of, you have to make distinction between different things. In interest there is determinatio est negatio. When you determine interest, you also determine what is not in this interest. Public interest therefore doesn't work, because it is kind of like common will, or what Rousseau called volonté générale or something like that, but understood in a liberal way. Liberal socialist, very strange thing. Yeah, that's why it's peculiar to see in America how people who push this are called liberals. But I would say, when you go into depths, when you go into metaphysics, because all this is based on metaphysics, but the books of people who created this in times of enlightenment and a bit later are rarely read. Or are rarely read in a context, or are rarely read in entirety and with integrity, with understanding that socialism also, like all modern political theory, is a kind of total metaphysics of politics. And on that note, we'll conclude. Hope you find this informative. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic, Kali Tribune, signing out.